Hey, welcome to My Mama Summer. My name is Aimee Devlin. I'm an unconventional millennial mother living abroad, building a business and raising children while stepping into who she's meant to be. This podcast is an audio version of my newsletter, which you can find at mymamasummer.com. The episodes are short, wholehearted reflections of my life as a mother, business owner, and everyday human committed to being the best she can be. Pop in your headphones, grab a cuppa and a cookie, and take this time to just be with me. Hello everyone and welcome back to My Mama Summer. Today I have a beautiful guest with me. Her name is Meagan Rose Wilson, and I'm bringing her on because she's a mama as well as me. She's also in the Northern Hemisphere, it's called the Waldorf realm. In the Southern Hemisphere, we call it the Steiner realm. She's a woman who parents with intentionality, which I really enjoy. She brings a lot of consciousness to her world, her life, and her home. And she has a podcast which really talks about honoring ourselves and the life that we live with ourselves, with our children, and working with the seasons, the cycles, with a rhythm and a routine and a reverence. And I believe we really need a lot more of that in our lives as women and men in this world that is so busy. It is a digital age. There is so much happening, and we often don't take enough time out for ourselves, or we don't really know how to, because sometimes we can't really slow down to the extent that we want to. But what Meagan's work shows me is that we can kind of just add in these little pieces along the way that do make it easier for us to do that. And, I've seen this in my own mothering with my daughter, the importance of rhythm. Like in her life, rhythm is really useful for her. She's a very active human. She loves to just live with gusto. And when I can parent her with a rhythm, when she knows what's coming up, either in the day or the week or in the season, I know that she feels safer and more secure in who she is and where she is in her surroundings. And she really thrives on that familiarity. And, I feel like a lot of the time as parents, we forget about doing that for ourselves as well. It's challenging, not just for me. Like if I find it challenging in my life, that I know that other women are feeling that as well. I've seen and heard a lot of women who have kids who are a little bit older than mine. I mean, I'm in the thick of it right now. My daughter's 3. We're going to have more children, and I know that it gets easier as they age because they become more independent and not so reliant on us. But what I see out there in the world is we're in this age of social media, which is the highlight reel, and we don't see it all. But it's like there's a lot of women saying, just take care of yourself, like just put yourself first. And, there's a whole thing around that topic. But it's not as easy as it looks or as people say it is, especially in the early days of having a child. And so what I'd love to do is bring Meagan on to talk about that, to talk about her experience in her own personal life and in her work in helping families create more peace and calm and connection in their homes by bringing this routine and this rhythm and ritual in so that they can nourish themselves and their families. So Meagan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me here. I'd love to know, to start with, like what led you particularly to focus on these 3 kind of core tenets of rhythm, routine, and reverence?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Amy.
You're welcome.
Rhythm, routine, and reverence. So, those are all Waldorf inspired concepts, you might say, and they're especially prominent in Waldorf early childhood circles. So, for children kind of from birth all the way up till age 7, you might find that like a Waldorf preschool teacher or a kindergarten teacher would really focus in on providing rhythm and routine for a child and modeling a reverence and wonder. And I came across Waldorf. I just happened to find a parent and child group when my first child was about 2, and I fell in love with it. And I thought it was just so aesthetically beautiful. The rhythm was so calming and soothing, both for my child and for me. I became so enamored with the education that now I have 4 children. My youngest is 9, my oldest is now 16. and they've been going to Waldorf all the way through their first few years in Australia and now in Canada. And somewhere along those lines, I also studied Waldorf education and became an early childhood teacher myself. And I've led a lot of parent and child groups primarily. And it wasn't for many, many years until I realized that actually this concept of like the rhythm and the routine and this sense of reverence was just so important for me as the caregiver, and it was so nourishing and so supportive, and that, you know, probably unconsciously, I was drawn to the education not because I mean, it is so beautiful for your children, but probably because it was also just so good for me. And so, because I've worked for so long with children and their parents, I started really focusing in on parents and how I could support them with these concepts because we often, especially with younger children, really focus in on how we can support them, and then we, like you said, like, lose a little bit of that care for ourselves, and I think it can be a both and.
I agree. And that's what I'm seeking, for myself. It's like, I know it's possible. And what you said there, that's the exact feeling that I had when my daughter started to go to a little Waldorf kindergarten. Like the moment I actually was in tears the first time that I walked into this room and saw how much care and honor is, and it's making me emotional now, that is given to these children. Like the whole child is honored and, like you say, received with a reverence, and I fell in love with it that moment that I walked into that kindergarten as well, because I was like, I immediately started going into the place of what if every child in the world was looked after in this way? Like, how could things be different if we were all honored in this way?
Yeah, and if you extend it to yeah, not only if every child was honored in that way, but every human was honored in that way, and, you know, it sounds so cliché, but you have to start with yourself and honoring yourself that way and giving yourself, like, that worthy respect, and so, yeah, it's kind of like, a lot of what I do, the courses I offer, and how I work with people is almost creating, like, a little Waldorf kindergarten type space for us as parents and caregivers.
I'm there. I feel like part of me just wants to be at school with my daughter. Like, we're preparing at the moment for the lantern walk, which is tonight for my daughter's school, which is such a beautiful time of the year, particularly here in the Northern Hemisphere. And we were just talking off air beforehand about, so I personally, as an Australian, came from a place that was warm and humid pretty much all year round. Like the winter, you can go to the beach in winter, lay on the sand and you've got a blue sky and it's rarely raining and those kinds of things. And so there was a disconnect between being able to listen to or read or understand like these philosophies of like, okay, now it's the season of coming inward, when my external reality wasn't reflecting that. Whereas now I'm able to actually see that and feel that. And I feel more in connection with my external environment, which allows me to actually feel like I'm living more seasonally and to participate in these kinds of rituals and go more inward at certain times and come out. Whereas I found it super challenging in Australia. I had to work harder to make it happen because it wasn't like, oh, the nights are really long now and it's about to snow, or I've got to get the winter coats out, or, this kind of stuff. That's not a thing in Australia. It was much harder for me to create that rhythm.
Yeah, like we were saying off air, the Waldorf and or Steiner festivals were created by Rudolf Steiner in Europe, like, many years ago, or not created. He was using concepts from Christian festivals and, pagan rituals and festivals and kind of put his own anthroposophical spin on those, and so they are going to respect and honor and reflect the way that the weather and the seasons change there, and so it's much harder. I mean, I don't even recommend trying to really translate that into the Southern Hemisphere, so that's for the Australians or other people in the Southern Hemisphere to really dig deeper into what those seasonal shifts look like for them. The archetypes are so much more apparent and easy to notice in the northern hemisphere, at least those European archetypes.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I feel that our media and, there's a huge component of that that comes from the Northern Hemisphere into Australia. And
Yeah.
even the Christmas cards and stuff, they all have snow on them. In Australia, we're having a barbecue by the pool. Like it's completely different thing. But yeah, like for me, it's like this romantic thing being here. We
Yeah.
there's all these different types of like little pumpkins, and I've got this little altar, and there's all this amazingness that I'm exploring now, being in the Northern Hemisphere, that I didn't have. And that's one of the beautiful things about moving around the world and, experiencing life in different countries and cultures and climates and that kind of thing. But I really feel like I'm coming into this part of my life where I get to have that experience, and I'm really grateful for that. But if you are in a climate or a place where it's not necessarily in alignment, I mean, I'm surprised that maybe someone has created this, but someone hasn't kind of translated that into like the Australian kind of archetypes or the seasons.
I think there are some Waldorf curriculums that are coming out that look more at like how an Indigenous community in a certain place in Australia would celebrate or honor like seasonal changes. I don't have exact links, but I know there are people out there that have started to figure that out.
There has to be, right? With the internet and the way we are right now, there has to be someone doing that. Now, I feel like the Waldorf world, it's like, this is at least my experience, is like once I came into it, I knew that this was my thing and I wasn't leaving and this was for me. I just felt it internally. But some of these concepts might feel a little bit foreign to people who aren't inside of this world. I understand like the concept of rhythm in parenting my daughter and this kind of thing, but I'd love for you to kind of explain, for instance, how can we bring more rhythm and what does rhythm even mean? Especially in comparison to routine, because I know those two things are not the same thing, but they can be perceived as the same thing.
Yeah, so rhythm is like routine in the sense that it's set and it's repetitive. You might have a weekly rhythm and on Mondays you bake and on Tuesdays you do painting for young children, let's say. But the difference between routine and rhythm is that routine would be like much more strict about the timing. So it would be like at a very specific time. Let's say like 12 o'clock, we have lunch every day. That's kind of a routine. But the rhythm would be more that at 11 o'clock, we are outside playing. At 11:45-ish, we're coming in and taking our coats off. And around 12-ish, we're sitting down and saying a blessing and eating, but it's not like set in stone. It's just the sequence of the events. And also the other difference with routine and rhythm, it doesn't have to be a difference because you could set up a routine this way, is that rhythm is often like breathing in and out. So you're balancing these really extroverted or like exciting, energetic activities, often like playing outdoors, or, maybe for an adult, it would be more like socializing. And then having maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours of that. And then the next part of your day would be something that would be like an in breath or something quieter. It would be like reflective. You might have a rest, some kind of a quiet time. You might read a book or do inner work or whatever it is. So there's this real breathing in and out of your day. You're structuring your day in a way that it goes in and out and is breathing and balanced.
I feel like that's a really useful tool. I know that I use that for my daughter, but in hearing you say that, I'm like, that's a useful tool for adults as well as children. I see, a lot of people's calendars. I'm an online business mentor as well. And, some people's calendars, the whole day is just like call, 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 or this. And there is no space for that in breath. And just creating an intentional time for those in-breaths can be so useful, and I always forget to do that. Like, it's like this
Yeah.
constant reminder that I need to keep plastering on my eyelids.
Yeah, I mean, like right now, I'd see a trend online. There's a lot of information about nervous system regulation and how to regulate your nervous system. And I think, like, in the Waldorf world, that's what rhythm is. It's trying to regulate yourself by allowing those moments of just real extroversion or excitement or socialization, and then balancing them with like inward moments of calm and just like recalibrating.
I really love that. That's a useful reminder for every single human on the planet. One thing with rhythm that I really enjoyed when I heard and implemented with my daughter is just the simple fact of her understanding what's coming next and how that creates like a feeling of safety within her. And just as a tiny example, we used to really struggle getting clothes on her to get her outside because she's very strong willed and she's independent and she wants to do her own thing and do it her way. And what we did was we just introduced a little song like at a specific time of the morning when we know, okay, she's got to get those clothes on soon so that we can get her out of the door. And so we just have a little song and it's just, it's time to get dressed now. They're the words, like it's so simple. And as soon as we start singing that, she just gets dressed on her own now. Where it used to be
Yeah.
like, come here, it's like wrestling this tiny little human to try and get her to do something. Like coming from the non-Waldorf world, it can be kind of weird. Like, what do you mean you just sing a song and your child will do something? But I think that really speaks to the power of what a rhythm does for a child.
Yeah, there's like a few things going on there. So one is like you're also putting ritual in with the rhythm. So the ritual is that you always sing the song. And then the rhythm is that you will probably at the same time every day do that thing. And then there's the repetition, which is so important for early childhood because then it just becomes something that you always do as a family. So there's less pushback or fights when it's just what you do. So the difference would be if you still had to get out the door every single day, but maybe some mornings after breakfast you went and brushed teeth, whereas other mornings you brush your teeth and then you had breakfast, or some mornings this happens because it's life, but some mornings you go to preschool and some mornings are home days or whatever it is. That's when it's harder for a young child. The more repetition there is and the more consistency there is. And then when you add in those beautiful nonverbal rituals, because children do communicate better with less words, all of those pieces together make for an easier transition.
Mm. Yeah, it amazes me how much easier it is now. Just implementing that one thing. And I recently wrote an article about this and did a podcast episode about why I don't homeschool. And it's not having a dig at people who do homeschool because I really value that component of parents who choose that. But I spoke a lot about it, about how I don't feel that the environment that I have at home is worthy of imitation constantly. Like I really struggle with all of the things that I have going on in my life. I'm not able to provide the sense of reverence and the rhythm just constantly that she is able to get elsewhere in an environment that is specifically curated to give that to her. She goes and she has this beautiful experience every single day where that's provided for her. And then, the weekend it's a different thing. Like it's not the same rhythm, right? Which
Yeah.
makes it harder for
Yeah.
everyone. It's not just harder for us, it's harder for her as well because she doesn't know what to expect in that next moment because it can be different. Like we're meeting up with friends for breakfast or this thing's happening or we're going on a hike or whatever. Like it's different. And I really noticed that within her, like the calm that comes from knowing what's coming next.
Yeah, it's really interesting weekends, like with children that do go to school, weekends are often a question that comes up a lot in my coaching and working with families with young children. And generally, I just advise them to not worry about it and to just let weekends be weekends and they will feel different. But at the same time, for sure, you can set up like little rhythms or rituals that are consistent in the weekend. Like, number one, I would always say try to keep the waking up and the meal times and the bedtimes consistent even on weekends. So you're not going from like a 7 p.m. bedtime to like a 9 p.m. bedtime, or you're not suddenly having lunch at 3 p.m. because you had a late breakfast and then their body clock's kind of thrown. At the same time, weekends are always going to feel different. It's also something that came up for me too when you were saying all of that. Another common topic is like the mom parenting sometimes, and then the dad comes in, like, let's say on the weekends, or dads come in at night and they shift the energy. And I would say with something like that, it's like, well, the dad will have his own rituals and rhythms, hopefully, that they follow. And you don't want total chaos coming in, but it is a very different energy from one caregiver to an next.
Oh, yes.
Rhythm with the idea of, like, having strong rhythms and routines and rituals isn't to just make everything really mundane and so repetitive that it's frustrating for everyone and you feel like you have no room for spontaneity or fun or joy. It's just trying to really strike that balance, and I think especially for parents with children that are like 7 and under, that is the season for stronger routines and rhythms, and then as your children get older, there is, like, a little bit more breathing room with that, and you don't have to be quite so consistent.
Yeah, and I feel like part of the reason for creating those rituals and the rhythm in those early years is that as they age, they internalize that and it becomes part of who they are as a human. And it creates that self discipline within them. And they take that with them throughout their whole life, right? That's part of the foundation that we're creating in those first 7 years by doing that.
Yeah, I don't have tons of teenagers to compare to, but my 2 teenagers are still teenagers, so they love sleeping in and they prefer staying up late. I'm sure I could look up some scientific papers on how their brains are wired that way. But at the same time, they truly value their sleep. They know the difference between what it feels like to be like a little sleep deprived versus well rested. And yeah, they know the importance of having like at least three square nourishing meals a day, and all of my children highly value ritual and routine. And I think, whether there is an increase in neurodiversity for environmental reasons or whatever it is, or whether it's just that we're diagnosing people because we have more diagnostic capabilities, whatever it is, neurodiversity is pretty common nowadays. And I think, there one of my children is truly on the spectrum, and everyone else in our family is pretty quirky. And I would say, like, even more so for children that are neurodiverse, routine and ritual and rhythm is even more important, and for adults as well. So that's another piece to consider as well.
I feel like there's a lot of tools that we have access to that we weren't given access to when we were younger nowadays. And so I'm very grateful for that. Like we have all this stuff at our fingertips, even the mention of your nervous system and how to regulate your nervous system, and all the work that's being done in somatics these days and, all of this stuff that we have nowadays to be able to care for ourselves in a way that our parents didn't do for themselves is beautiful. And at the same time, it's still really hard to find the ability to do it all.
Yeah, definitely not in the past, like, I'd say 40, 50, 60 years, it wasn't happening. I think there are pockets of, like, communities or indigenous communities where a lot of, like, the routines and rhythms that are so repetitive and nourishing, like, it's just a part of the culture. If you think of, like, I don't know, way back before there was formal school and children were at home with their parents, there were usually, like, routines for every day of the week that people followed, like washing on Mondays and baking on Tuesdays. My friend Nicola, she's from like a small town in Germany, and she said, I think like every Friday they had like a shared community oven. And every Friday when she was a child, they would bring all their dough to the oven. It was their turn to bake in the oven. And then they would have to like make all that bread last all week. And, that was a community routine that was just what they did. And it was really grounding and nourishing for her as a child. And we've lost a lot of those like community rituals and routines. So we're having to like kind of recreate it and make it our own in our small little nuclear homes.
Yeah, we've lost a lot. When I hear you talking, even just about that, like that form of ritual of the baking as a community, like the way I feel when you say that is so warm and it's like coming home. I yearn for that, to have a society or to be part of a society that does that. We've missed that. I mean, I can't speak for all of the countries, but I was born in England. I know it's like that there. I grew up in Australia. It's like that there. Like, particularly in Australia, we as a collective, we're a very sort of lost culture. We don't really feel like we have a culture because we were convicts sent to an island that was stolen from original inhabitants, and that's what we came from. And so there aren't any kind of rituals or things that we brought with us except ones that came from a different hemisphere, from a different climate. And I feel that within my being there isn't a sense of like, oh, this is where I belong, and going back to my roots. There's not a remembering. It has to be a recreation of like, I need to bring this into my life and make it something for my family. And I feel like that's what you help people do. And that's so important.
Yeah. Yeah, because everyone comes from different backgrounds too and spiritual heritages, and some people might come from, like, myself, for example, I'm called a Christian in the sense that my parents were both Christian. I was christened, but that was about it. Never went to church or anything like that, but have celebrated all of the Christian festivals my whole life. But the spiritual component was completely removed, and they had become, like, very commercial. And that is one common theme. So I've been working really hard myself to try and imbue some of the traditions that were passed down to me with more spirituality and reverence. I'm bringing in some more like nature-based practices. How can I revere what's happening in the natural world around me at these times? But then there might be a family out there that is much more connected to their religious or their spiritual roots, and some of the spiritual aspects of these like Steiner or Waldorf festivals don't really resonate or are just like extra they don't need. And so how are they going to slightly tweak certain celebrations to make them their own and to feel connected? That's kind of the work that I do with each family and with each parent. And then I guess the next step, because before we were talking about community, is it would be so wonderful if we could start building community around these maybe shared values. And I don't know what that would look like exactly. I know, for example, in my children's school, what used to be an Advent festival, so that is already like very Christian leaning and it's around Christmas time, has become what is called the Festival of Light. And they bring in a lot of the shared similarities between something like Hanukkah or Diwali or Christmas, where there are shared kind of like archetypal themes of bringing that inner light to you and that strength. And then so we share as a community all these different festivals at the same time. But yeah, it's something to really explore. And I think it is, like you said, like it's a process of like recreating. We can't really go back to what was. That's for sure.
Yeah, because I feel like we're so lost from, I mean, obviously I'm overgeneralizing, but I'm just talking from my own experience. We're just so lost, like looking back at our own traditions or lineages, and everything's so multicultural and combined nowadays. We've moved all over the world and brought different traditions, and it's all together. Like they call Australia a melting pot, and Canada's very similar. Like, and they've encouraged that intentionally, and it's resulted in a lot of us feeling lost. And I feel like, especially for me, I do feel like this is a really core part of what's allowed me to feel more grounded as a mother and to feel like I'm creating something new with my family, that I get to kind of be the matriarch of like these traditions and decide what I do want for my family. And, I didn't come from a religious background. I was not christened. My parents weren't religious. We didn't have any form of like spiritual or religious, nothing. I guess was more on the atheist leaning than any form of religion. I don't know anything about religion except for what I've learned from other places. And so I'm an interesting kind of blank slate in that way. But what also comes with that is the lack of the richness that comes with learning from these religions and traditions and all that kind of stuff. So I really enjoy, like, I'm in Mexico, right? So here, instead of Halloween, there's Dia de Muertos, which we just had here, which was a beautiful celebration at my daughter's school. And that is one of my favorite things now, seeing how they celebrate that here. It's just so beautiful. in
Yeah.
comparison to other traditions. Like celebrating everyone who you know who has passed on, like as a ritual and a rhythm, like every year is really beautiful because in Australia, it's like someone dies, you go to their funeral, you have a little chat about them, and then that's it. It's done. You never bring it up again. It's not spoken about. That sucks.
Yeah.
Why do we do that? I don't know, but here it's really beautiful. They invited people, the kids, to bring in a photo to put it on the ofrenda, and they had a beautiful, like, I guess we'd call it an altar, an offering to the people who had passed from whenever. And kids brought in pictures of the cat that passed away, and they were like, "My cat died." They stood up and spoke about how much it meant to them and how their cat was still in their heart, and it was just like the most beautiful thing to witness. I just feel like we just don't have that where I grew up, and that was a huge missing piece, I guess is what I'm saying, and it is a huge theme of this conversation. And I feel like that's why I feel such a drawing to the Steiner way of doing things. It's like bringing that richness back into our life that's been missing in the Western world.
Yeah, for sure. I think, that's probably why my children are still there, is I think there is, like, this real soul component to the education. One of the expectations of teachers at a Waldorf school is that they do deep inner work on a regular basis, and the definition of that, I mean, there are very specific spiritual or like meditative exercises that Rudolf Steiner prescribed and that you can read about. But when I did my teacher training, it was left more open to interpretation. And it's really just like this expectation and understanding that we're all on a journey of like self growth and that we're always learning and changing and evolving and that we should always be working on ourselves. And it was just really emphasized that that is so important for a teacher to have that in their lives in order to be strong, beautiful, effective teachers and also to model that for the children. And so that has always been like a driving force for me wanting to send my children to a school like that because no teacher is perfect. No parent is perfect. Everyone has their things, but if you are, being led by someone who understands that they are on a journey and that they're always striving to grow and learn and change, I think that that is such an important thing for our children to be exposed to adults and teachers and leaders like that.
Mm, absolutely. To have that as the driving force. I mean, that's kind of my driving force as a human. That's why I feel like we're here is to learn from the mistakes that we make and to become a better human each and every day and do better when we know better and to trust that our children are in the hands of people who are on that same journey is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
You touched on reverence in relation to nature before, and I wanted to bring that up as well. As I was saying, we feel like lost and there's different cultures and different rituals. And I know that some people can get weird about rituals or religions or all these kinds of different things that we might bring into our life that may help us to bring in, what feels like it's missing. But I feel like nature is a really beautiful starting point for that, having a reverence for nature and witnessing how nature shifts and changes as the seasons do. And I'd love for you to speak about what that means for you, like how as mothers in the chaos of what everyday life is like, how can we bring more reverence into the days?
Yeah. So specifically reverence with nature, I would say it's just about getting outside is really the first step, and that is actually a challenging thing for parents with young children, just making it a regular practice to go outside every day and have outside time and not be on a mission to get somewhere else or do something else, and the goal is simply to just be outside would be the first step, because once you are out there, if you're present enough and you don't have your phone in front of you or you're not trying to multitask and, do multiple things on your list and be outside and you're just there observing and being present, you'll start to notice and appreciate all those like little subtle things. It's hard to describe, yet it's like the simplest thing in the world, but we are so distracted all the time. And I think our phones are a huge part of that because in some ways they're really convenient and like I can order my groceries on my phone, so I could, if my kids were still young, I could take them to the park and then sit there and order my groceries on the bench. But if you're constantly just going into the device instead of being present where you are, you're just going to miss so many of those tiny little gifts. I've done some courses with forest schools and like leading forest schools. And one thing that they have everyone practice is having a sit spot. I think there's different indigenous terms for this, but essentially it's finding a spot outside and hopefully the same spot. And for once a week or every day or whatever it is, having this practice of sitting there for 5, 10, 15 minutes and just observing in this really like non-judgmental, not goal-oriented way. And over time, if you continued to do that over months, you would see these like beautiful shifts in how the weather or the seasons change, or you might start noticing the same little chipmunk or bird or whatever it is that comes by and start noticing, oh, it's not just a bird, it's that bird. And all those subtle little noticings that probably our children pick up on all the time, that sense of like wonder and reverence is just going to be cultivated in those moments. And then the only other thing I would say about all of that is again like I'm not a phone hater. Like my whole business is online, but not to ruin all of that beauty and wonder by then like Googling the bird that you saw and like trying to figure out what its name, like what type of bird it is and oh, what does it sound like? And finding all the questions outside of that actual bird. So really trying to stay in that moment and that sense of like curiosity and wonder instead of going straight to our head and like trying to analyze everything and get answers outside of ourselves.
Mm. I love that last point because I feel like that's what a lot of traditional homeschooling is based upon is like that's how the days are structured. It's like, oh, we might see, oh, there's a butterfly outside my window right now. Like, okay, what type of butterfly is it? What's its life cycle? It's like it becomes this sort of really heady type thing. And we're not truly sitting in and witnessing and just experiencing life for
Yeah,
what it is.
and learning about it by observing it ourself, like observational, that's the very first key to, like, understanding anything, and it's not to say there's never room for all of those, like, heady answers, it's just like, let's just start with the wonder and the observation, and for children, it's really important, but I think also for adults because we're so stuck in that one way of thinking, it's a really good exercise to just sit in, like, wonder and curiosity.
Mm. I've noticed myself that a couple of times with my daughter, like I'm making a recipe or something and I think, what oven temperature should I put this on or something? And I think, okay, I need to go Google that. And I have to kind of extract myself out of the cooking with her to kind of like go to this whole other world. And I think, we used to be like that. We don't have the inner knowing anymore. We rely on all these devices to teach us, but it's not inside of us anymore.
Yeah, that just comes with practice, like so many things. And I think there is like, yeah, that trust in not knowing everything, trust in not getting it perfectly. Like I'm sure if you put it at 200 instead of 180 or whatever, it wouldn't be the end of the world. I'm that kind of cook. So there's probably a whole bunch of people that are cringing right now, but
I'm relearning how to bake at altitude. I didn't even know this was a thing. So there's this whole lot.
that will take a lot of time. That's the thing, like, if you get a new oven, it takes a really long time for you to really understand how it works, and I don't think, like, any instruction manual is ever gonna.
That's right, it's all in the experiencing, and allowing that is a new learning. It's interesting because I think we're probably of a similar generation which was like the last analog childhood generation. We had analog childhoods, and I got my first computer when I was 24. Like, it wasn't a thing in my childhood that I was on the computer all the time, and I'm not someone who uses my phone to do things. I do my work on my computer and kind of that's it. But I know that a lot of people do everything on their phone. They don't have a computer. And so like for me, I've definitely felt it that it's really useful for me to have that divide because I work online, that there needs to be a stop. I can't just go from one device to another device and like I don't have emails on my phone and
Yeah, right.
I've trained people to not call me, which is not a good thing, but that's something that I've really been navigating. And, my whole podcast is like a internal navigation of all of these different things that we have as mothers and business owners and human beings, like all of the stuff that's thrown at us throughout our lives these days in this modern world, and how we can kind of navigate that. You're an online business owner. I'm an online business owner. Like it's like there's these two separate worlds. Yeah, it's an interesting time to be in.
Yeah, there's so many amazing things about it and there's so many benefits, and I'm so grateful that I've been able to build community and do work online because that's what's enabled me to actually stay home and be the primary caregiver for my children. And even though they're all in school now, I mean, there's not a week that goes by where someone isn't sick with a cold with 4 in this season. So I'm always the one that's home for them if they're sick, and I'm not having to worry so much about that. And we're able to have our hobby farm and just do so many things that I wouldn't be able to do if I worked a 9 to 5 outside of the home. So there are so many benefits, but it is also so seductive, and you have to have really strong boundaries and model those for your children. And I don't have all the right answers. I don't think anyone does at this point. But yeah, it's a really hard thing to dance with, and our children are inheriting it on a whole other level because they don't know a world without screens and phones being just, like, constantly there.
Yeah, that's what I don't like the most.
It's so hard. I don't know. I think one of the other things that I love about Waldorf is that they do everything when the time is right and when they think something is developmentally appropriate. So in early childhood, up until like age 7, if you're a parent at a Waldorf school, you will hear over and over again, like, please just avoid screens as much as possible, no television or shows or movies, and just avoid media as much as you can for as long as you can in early childhood. Now, some of the conversations that aren't had as often at Waldorf schools and probably should be had is like, okay, so when do we tiptoe into media and start introducing it and start having a family movie night once a week, which is probably more in like grade school and through grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, you're slowly introducing more media. And there's so much media out there now. I think some parents are looking for guidance on how to more developmentally, like appropriately introduce things. At my children's school, it goes all the way up to high school. In the high school, they're not to have phones in the classroom. They have like these special little zip bags that lock up and they put them in there. But at the same time, sometimes the teacher will have like a project and they need to research or look something up, and they'll give out their phones and get them to take them out and teach them how to search certain information or to use their phones as a tool in a specific way. Or even using AI right now, there are times where the teachers are teaching them how to effectively use ChatGPT and AI and stuff. So I think it's not, and that's what they have to do. It's developmentally appropriate for a teenager that's about to go off and go to university and explore the world. And they have all of this like media at their fingertips. They do need leaders and teachers to hopefully model the best ways to use these as tools. But I mean, we're all trying to figure out those answers and what is appropriate and not appropriate.
Yeah, and it's changing so fast that it's,
Yeah.
really hard to keep up with that as teachers and curriculums. I think one of the things, the differences between the Waldorf kind of way of doing things and the mainstream or even the alternative realm, because I'm not in the mainstream realm, I'm in the alternative realm. So most of my friends are either doing like alternative styles of schooling or unschooling or homeschooling. No one's sending their kids to public school. That's not what the people who are in my network do. A huge blind spot for people who are alternatively minded is the fact that children aren't adults. And I feel like this is this huge, just missing part in the alternative community, is that we don't want to control kids and we don't want them to just blindly accept authority and, all these kind of things that are great to teach adults. People think they need to teach that to children. And that's one thing that I'm really passionate about, is kind of having people understand that like they're completely different things. It's not the same. It's not appropriate.
Yeah. No, yeah. So in the Waldorf world, they have like those 7-year cycles. So you've heard me say that early childhood is birth to 7, and then there would be like middle childhood, which is ages 7 to around 14, and then the like late teenage years or like later childhood, which is 14 to 21. And then, technically around 21, we become adults. And I mean, those ages are approximate, but yeah, I think brain science shows that we're not like fully developed and our prefrontal cortex isn't, as fully in charge as it can be until maybe around like 23-ish or something like that. So those ages kind of line up. And in Waldorf, in terms of, I even hesitate to use the word discipline, but let's say like leadership or such a bad word these days. Yeah, teaching our children the birth to 7. So these words come from Kim John Payne, who is a Waldorf educator, and he wrote Simplicity Parenting. He says from birth to 7, we are our children's governors. So we really are kind of setting the tone. We are making the routine. We are telling them what's right and wrong and modeling that for them. And we're like really holding those rules strongly. And then from ages 7 to 14, we're more like gardeners. So we're still planting the seeds and tending to that garden and pruning it, but the plants have like a little bit of a life of their own and they can, they might sprout flowers where we didn't realize they would, and we're tending to those. So it's like a dance between letting the child have some creative freedom and push back, and then, yeah, kind of cutting that back and still holding boundaries. And then from 14 to 21, we're the guide. And we're just really there to like guide them in the right direction and still continue like modeling those values and what is right and wrong, but we can't force them into anything. And that is much more developmentally appropriate than trying to be a guide to a 3-year-old and letting them make a choice about like 5 different things, or do you want to have your nap today? Like, they're never going to give you the right answer. We know when they're 3, they need a nap today, or maybe not 3. I know a lot of 3-year-olds skip their naps, but let's say 1.
Yeah. I love those 3 words. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. To me, that's so important, and I've seen that in the children that I've been around in different circles and in different ways that people are raising their children. There are some kids who just have 0 boundaries whatsoever, and they're treated like an adult, and they're 3 years old. And this is obviously the spectrum of, I see this happen in so many different areas. It's like, okay, we have public mainstream schooling, which is this one thing, and then we now have like radical unschooling, which is on the other end of the spectrum, where it's like, just let your kid do anything. They can stay up to 2 a.m., they can spend their entire day playing video games, and they can eat whatever they want. And in the middle, there's some kind of, truth. But what I've seen and noticed a lot in the unschooling kind of community is that the kids are seeking a boundary. They push and push and push, and they don't understand where the edge is. There's no edge. There isn't an edge. And so they don't feel safe, and they just continue to kind of do that forever, trying to figure out like, okay, where is this boundary? And I feel like that's not useful for children. I've seen that in the real world experience.
Yeah. No, young children love boundaries. I mean, we all love boundaries. We all feel safer around people who are very clear with their intentions and how they want you to treat them and how they're going to treat you. Like, it just feels much safer than someone who you can't really predict and you don't know how they're going to behave or how you should act around them or what their boundaries are. It's pretty intuitive, but yeah, somehow we've lost that basic wisdom along the way.
Yeah.
I think it was a pendulum swing, right? Like, because boundaries became this idea of corporeal punishment and spanking and stuff like that. And so it left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And then that big pendulum swing just went the other way.
And, we went from like authoritative parenting to gentle parenting and not being able to say anything to your child and like allowing them to control everything and seeing them as the whole being. And you just, all of these kind of systems and things that we've developed to allow us to see humans for what they are. I feel like a lot of the time, a lot of people aren't making a distinction between there's adults and children. It's not the same thing, but a lot of
Mhm.
kind of the modern way of doing parenting seems to speak to children as adults. It's like give them the agency and that kind of stuff. And in my personal view, I've seen that isn't necessarily the road ahead that I want to take for my family.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would love to know If you have any kind of parting words for how you feel the best way is to bring this world into the world of motherhood for someone who's not necessarily in the Waldorf world, or for someone who is a busy mum living in a country that's not where her roots are and she feels lost and busy and cut off from her ancestors and routine and all of the things that are our birthright but we're rediscovering. What advice would you give to mothers, in a practical sense, that where they can begin? I mean, I loved your insight into the sit spot. To me, that was a really beautiful thing that I'm going to implement. When you said that, I was like, oh my God, I've already started to do this because we have recently moved into a house where we have a rooftop. So we have this beautiful rooftop view of the city. And I can already see, like, there's a bumblebee who lives in the little piece of wood nearby, and he comes and visits us in the afternoons, and there's certain types of butterflies that come in and visit us, and the sun's gently moving and setting earlier, and all these kind of things. Like, I'm already kind of doing that without even noticing. But aside from that, what are some just parting practical tips that you would be able to offer?
Yeah, I mean, if you're brand new to creating like rhythms and routines for yourself and your family, I think the first step, the very first step that I tell everyone, and I mentioned this before, is to just establish consistent wake up times, meal times, and bedtimes for everyone, including yourself. If you did just that, you would feel so much better and your children would feel so much better. And I say for you as well, that means that like consistently, even if your children are at school, are you still feeding yourself a nice, warm, nourishing lunch every day? Or are you just like rushing from task to task because you know you have a short window of time before you have to go and pick them up? And the same with bedtime. Can you hold boundaries with yourself around what time you go to bed and how your bedtime rituals are set up? Because we're so intentional about the way that we do our bedtime rituals for our children and reading a book and having a nice calming bath and singing a song. But then do you nurture yourself in the same way at bedtime? Do you hold like screen time boundaries with yourself? Do you do something that feels really like nourishing and calming before bed? Do you turn out your light at a certain time so that you know you can get as good a sleep as you can? I know with little ones and feeding through the night, it's a different story. But just those three basics alone would be so transformative. And then the other piece of advice I would give is grab a journal and really write down what are all those responsibilities and things on like a weekly basis. Like right now, just take a week of your life that are keeping you busy. It would almost be like writing down your whole schedule and then really look at that and think like, are all the things on this list aligned with our values? So let's say one of your children has soccer 3 days a week. In some senses, maybe it like aligns with your values. You really value physical activity for your children. Soccer is like a sport that maybe has been passed down from generation to generation, whatever it is. And you think it's really important that you spend all those hours driving to practice and sitting at practice and coming home, etc. Or maybe you think actually little Joey doesn't even like soccer and I'm really not into it and it's stressing the heck out of us. And like, why are we doing this 3 days a week? And is it some kind of cultural pressure or because my friend's son did it and I signed up? And just question how your days are being filled up and simplify, cut back because it's more likely than not that we're doing more than we is really necessary for just in our schedules and for our children especially. Yeah, if you do those 2 things, everything would change, and that would be a really good starting point.
That's really good, solid, practical advice that anyone can implement. And I know for me, I think about, like, if I'm to honestly answer you, like in relation to the bedtime, exactly what you said, my daughter's is all prioritized, right? And then it's like, for me, it's just like the sense of relief, like, that's done now. And it's just like now what? There is no ritual for me. And this is a common thing that happens with a lot of mums because I've had this conversation. It's like, oh, I've got some time for me. What do I do? So I'll just waste it. A lot of mums say that they just waste that time because they're so kind of overwhelmed with, oh my God, I finally have some time to myself. What should I do with it? And so what you've just shared there is a really beautiful way of counterbalancing that and then creating something for ourselves. which we
Yeah,
both
so do
desperately
that
want.
journaling ritual again and write down, like 10 things that you do wanna do for yourself, and then how can you break them into, like, a 20-minute increment before bed or, whatever that pocket of time is. I hate to be such a hater of phones, but I'm speaking from my own experience too, like, I think we waste way more time on phones than we ever want to admit, and we take so many of those micro moments in the day when I think back to my own childhood, and my mom worked and was really busy and did tons of volunteer work, and we had like very mainstream busy schedules. But I am certain that she had so much more time to sit and think and like process than we do now because we are so constantly distracted. And every micro moment we get, we pick up our phone and start scrolling. And so my husband is a recovered alcoholic. He's been sober for 8 years, and one of the first steps in AA is to, like, admit that you have a problem. So I'm really big on that the very first step for our society nowadays is to admit that we do have a problem with our screens. I'll probably pick up my phone right after this podcast and open up some apps. But I think like the more that I can be like honest with myself and that it's not an ideal form of using my time, then the more that I can start catching myself and bringing more awareness to changing my habits 5 minutes a day at a time.
Absolutely. My previous episode was called Scrolling Away Self Worth. And it's all about exactly what you've just said then. I said to you earlier, I don't really use my phone for anything, but I set a timer sometimes for 10 minutes and I'll look at Instagram because I have an online business and I was told that I need to use Instagram and, all these stories. And even in that 10 minutes, which isn't even every day, like it might be like 4 times a week. So 40 minutes a week, let's say, on Instagram. You can read in that article or that episode the effect on me, like what happens inside of my psyche just from those 10 minutes, like what's happening for me. And it's not beneficial. It's not useful. It's not bettering myself. It's not improving my confidence. And it's not really growing my business. It's a lie. I feel like, especially in the business world, we've been fed a lot of masculine kind of ways of doing things. There's this stuff like habit stacking where, instead of just going for a walk, you listen to a podcast while you're going for the walk. And like it's like everything's trying to make us do as much as we can, as fast as we can. And what we're talking about today is essentially the antithesis of that. As someone who's been in the online business world and who has absorbed so much of that information and programming, I'm now in this opposite world that feels so much more nourishing to me and I know is better for me, but it's a deprogramming of that and an undoing of all of those patterns and all of the damage that's been done by taking on all that stuff that isn't really beneficial. Yeah, phones are a huge part of that, even though like I think about, well, if I'm someone who only does that for 10 minutes and I have some discipline and I'm someone who does it this way, what about the people who are doing it the other way?
Mhm.
A huge topic that we shouldn't get into right now, but it's an interesting world to be living in right now. And I'm so grateful we have both sides of the coin, as we always do. There's always the black, the white, and the gray, right? We always have the antidote to the poison. And I definitely feel like so much more grounded in myself and so much richer knowing that this is my life now. I'm moving into a different way of doing things as you have been doing for so long. And it's great to look towards people you have a 16-year-old and you're ahead of me on the pathway. And so I appreciate you kind of looking back and sharing your wisdom with me.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. I love talking about all these different things and going deep with parents. I think the first step to everything and anything is to just get curious and ask questions instead of just going into autopilot with anything that we do.
Totally. So before we head off, I would love for you to just share if there's any links or courses you've got upcoming, any offerings that you'd love to share with my audience so they can learn how they can work with you or learn from you as we move forward.
Yeah, so I do offer a printed journal that has specific prompts for each day. So if you are looking for just 5 minutes a day of some reflective inner work, and it does bring a lot of the themes that we talked about on the podcast, the seasonality and connecting with nature and self-care. That is called the Golden Time Journal, and you can find that at store.meaganrosewilson.com. And then I offer a lot of online seasonal courses. The one that would be coming up right now is Winter in the Home. So that is this marriage between the spiritual aspects of bringing intention and meaning into like seasonal rituals for your family, but also like really practical printables and different ways of approaching things like, for example, children's chores and like, a really simple chore chart to help children from 7 to 14 start understanding and marrying the beautiful rhythms that they had in early childhood with like responsibilities and what they need to get done in a day and the sequencing of that. And then you can find me. I have over 200 articles on so much of what we shared today on Substack. So that's meaganrosewilson.substack.com. And there are always lots of different resources there. I have a podcast, so I'm sure Aimee can link to all of that. There's so many ways that you can work with me. There's tons of free resources, and then there's the courses and other things.
Amazing. You mentioned you work with families as well. Are you doing one-on-one work with people? Is that something you're offering at the moment as well?
Yeah, I do have one-on-one coaching. So if you Google Meagan Rose Wilson Acuity, you'll find my scheduling link there. Or if you go to my website or the Substack account, you'll find a link to the coaching as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So many ways to work with you. Yeah, I've only recently discovered the wonders of Substack, and I'm replacing my 10 minutes of Instagram time with 10 minutes of Substack time, which I have already found is way more useful for me because I can read an article about the winter rhythm instead of scrolling 100 stories in that time and not learning anything.
Yeah, I just named as well, and I love engaging in like that kind of long form content. And I just find I have written so many, and I don't wanna say I'm not humble, but, like, they are beautiful, rich articles over the past 15 years of doing this work, and I think they just sit very stale and quiet on my website, and Substack makes them so much more accessible and easy to find. There's so much value there for you.
Mm, yeah, it's a way more enriching use of our time. I'm really grateful for Substack. My husband's been writing on Substack for a long time. It just wasn't in my world. And now it is. And I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we never listen to our partners for me. I just, it's something outside.
Didn't realize what it was. I just didn't think it was for me
Yeah.
until I realized it was for me. And now I've found so many people there who are my people. It's a really beautiful community experience. There's the black, the white, and the gray. Like social media is telling us that everyone's attention spans are so short these days, or you have to make reels and you have to do this thing and you have to do that. And there's also this completely opposite world over here where you can write an article that many people will read, no matter how long it is, as long as it's, useful information, and they will share with you their insights and share it with other people. And two things are true, which is a really beautiful thing to know, especially in this world. There are still people who read because that's me, right? I love to read in preference to watching videos. And now I can be in a place that supports me to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Meagan, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I feel like it's a lot of value to my listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. If you enjoyed this episode and like reading as much as you do listening, I would love to welcome you as another subscriber to my newsletter. Head on over to mymamasummer.com to subscribe and let me know what you loved most about this episode. I love hearing your feedback. It's my favorite part of sharing what's on my heart. I'll see you over there. Have a beautiful day.